The sky turned gold behind the pine trees as I pulled up the gravel driveway to the house I once called home. The Braith house hadn't changed, same white shutters, same ivy-covered porch, but I had. I'd spent the last decade in Seattle building my company, buying my own piece brick by Digital Brick. But even $5 million in the bank hadn't bought immunity from this house or from the man waiting inside it. Mom's hug came first, tight, warm, lavender-scented. "Callum," she whispered against my shoulder. "You made it. I wouldn't miss it," I said, meaning every word. For her, I wouldn't. Inside the party buzzed gently piano jazz, playing low wine glasses, clinking cousins mingling. She floated among them radiant at 62 in her emerald shawl. I almost forgot why I hated this place. Then Ronan appeared. "Callum," he said with that voice of forced familiarity. He wore his usual uniform gray blazer, smugness crisp as starch. "Come drink with your old man." He handed me a glass of wine, deep red, smooth surface, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "To my prodigal son," he said. "This one's special." I stared at the glass. My throat dried. I remembered the nights he dragged me out of bed for no reason, the belt, the way he called it, discipline. I remembered the silence of Mom's closed door, and now here he was, toasting my success like he hadn't tried to break me. I smiled. "Cheers." He raised his glass. I raised mine. We clinked. Then he turned to greet someone behind him. In that breath of a moment I moved, slid my glass behind the breadbasket, took his from the ledge beside the sink, identical down to the stem. My fingers barely trembled. He came back, lifted his glass, my glass, and took a long, satisfied sip. I didn't touch mine. Instead, I looked across the yard where my mother stood near the lanterns, laughing at something my cousin had said, her hand gently brushing her silver hair behind her ear. For a second, it almost felt normal. But I knew what I'd done, and I knew something wasn't right when his smile lasted too long. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Ronan moved easily through the garden, pausing to shake hands, smirk for photos, laugh with that smooth, practiced ease that made people forget who he really was. I followed him with my eyes barely touching my untouched glass. My mother kept checking in with me from across the yard with a soft smile, oblivious to the storm forming just a few feet away. At minute 25, I saw the first crack. Ronan faltered mid-laugh while talking to Uncle Bram. His hand twitched slightly, just enough for his wine to slosh. He recovered quickly, straightening his back like nothing had happened, but I saw it. That tension in his jaw, the way he blinked too hard. At minute 30, he dropped. He was standing near the lanterns recounting some embellished tale about a condo flip in Tahoe when his sentence stopped halfway. His brow tightened, and he looked around almost confused. Then his knees buckled. The wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the brick. Guests gasped. Someone screamed. "My mother! Ronan!" she yelled, rushing to him. He was clutching his chest, gasping as if the air had turned solid, the same red flush crawling up his neck, the glaze forming over his eyes. I'd seen it before, not on him, but from inside my own body months ago after a similar glass of wine from the same hand. I didn't move at first. I just watched. My body somehow remembered before my mind did. The dizziness, the weight in my limbs, the taste of iron beneath my tongue, the feeling of slipping away while everyone else laughed on. I stepped forward slowly. Guests were shouting for an ambulance. Someone tilted Ronan onto his side. My mother knelt beside him, her hands trembling, her voice high-pitched and panicked. I bypassed them, crouching near the shattered glass. One piece was large enough to hold a few drops of dark red. I pulled a napkin from the buffet, carefully gathered what I could into a paper cup, and tucked it into my coat pocket. No one saw. They were too busy hovering around the man who always made himself the center of every room. The sirens came quick. I stood near the porch as they wheeled him away. My mother called my name, but I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the space where he'd fallen, the shards of glass glinting in the grass, catching the last light of the party. We sat on the garden bench, just where the paramedics had wheeled him out. The lanterns had burned low. The party was over, but the silence he left behind felt louder than the music ever did. My mother held a cup of tea untouched. Her fingers curled around it like she needed the heat to believe she was still here. I sat beside her, the paper cup with the wine sample tucked deep in my coat pocket. Neither of us had spoken since getting back from the hospital. "They say it might have been a panic attack," she said finally, her voice barely there. "Or low blood sugar. Something vague and convenient." I didn't answer. She stared out across the yard, but it wasn't. Was it? I turned toward her. You know it wasn't. Her eyes closed and she took a shaky breath. "Callum, there's something I've never told you." I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want it to matter. I waited. When my father died, it was sudden. He was healthy, never missed a checkup, but the night before he'd had drinks with Ronan, just the two of them. They were talking about investments. She paused. The next morning he didn't wake up. They said it was a heart attack. I felt my chest tighten. "How old was I? 7, she said, looking at me. "You cried for days. You barely spoke." A memory stirred something dim, buried. I saw Ronan, early morning light, coming through the kitchen window wearing dish gloves, scrubbing something at the sink with a strange urgency. A wine glass. I hadn't thought about it in decades. I thought it was normal. "I saw him cleaning glassware the next day," I said slowly. "He never does dishes, but he was scrubbing that wine glass like it had blood on it." She turned to me, her expression cracking. "I wanted to believe he loved me," she said. "I needed to believe it." I said nothing. My fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. She reached over, placed her hand on mine. "Callum, if what you're thinking is true, it means I've been sleeping next to a murderer." I looked at her not as a son looking for comfort, but as a man staring into the mouth of something monstrous. And this time, I didn't look away. Thanksgiving arrived colder than usual, a gray kind of cold that didn't belong in Oregon, but settled in the bones anyway. I thought about not going. I thought about faking illness, letting the day pass like a storm I watched from a distance. But Mom called that morning, her voice hopeful, in a way that made refusal feel like betrayal. I told her I'd be there by 4. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon when I arrived. There were more people this time, relatives I hadn't seen in years, laughing too loudly, avoiding the thin air between my father and me. He was already seated at the head of the table, gray suit as pristine as ever, glass of red wine in hand, like nothing had happened. "Callum," he said when he saw me, nodding slightly. "Good of you to join us." I nodded back, walked around the table, kissed my mother's cheek. She squeezed my hand gently. Her eyes asked 100 silent questions, but neither of us said a word. Dinner was normal, almost irritatingly so. Chatter forks against plates, the occasional polite laugh. But I felt him watching me, waiting. When dessert plates were cleared, Ronan stood. He tapped his glass lightly, waited until the room quieted. "A toast," he said. "To family, to resilience, and to my son for returning home when it matters." He raised a glass toward me. "This one's special." The same line. He walked over, handed me a fresh glass of wine. I took it. My hands didn't shake. As he returned to his seat, I reached for my napkin and dropped it. Everyone looked away for a second long enough. I bent, scooped the napkin with one hand, and with the other slid my untouched glass beside his plate, exchanging it for the one he'd just taken a sip from. Seamless, clean. He smiled across the table as he lifted the glass, now mine, and drank. A long, deliberate sip. Then he turned to speak to my uncle as if nothing had passed between us. I didn't drink. Instead, I watched. 10 minutes passed, then 20, 35. His laughter softened, his posture stiffened. He blinked twice, missed his fork when he reached for it. At minute 45, he clutched his chest. It happened just like before, only this time the silence that followed was sharper. Ronan staggered backward, eyes wide. His glass fell smashing against the tile. My mother screamed. Aunt Sylvia grabbed for the phone. The room erupted around me, voices panicked, chairs scraping back from the table. But I stayed seated. My pulse barely moved as I watched him crumble at the center of it all, gasping for air, like a man trying to escape something inside himself. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I drove down the coast to a private lab I'd found through a friend in the tech world. No names, no paperwork, just a quiet drop-off, and a technician who didn't flinch when I said, "Test this for anything unusual." I handed her the sealed vial of wine and waited in silence while she labeled it. She said it would take 72 hours. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. Back in Portland, the hospital released Ronan the same day I returned. Unexplained cardiac episode, they called it, likely stress-induced. He came home looking thinner, but not fragile, just quieter, like he was rehearsing calm. The call came exactly on time. "We found a high concentration of barbiturate," the technician said. "Lethal if left untreated. You were right to test it." I thanked her. My hand shook only after I hung up. The next morning I walked into the house without knocking. My mother was in the kitchen preparing tea with the same automatic movements she used when she didn't want to feel anything. She gave me a nod, eyes low. "He's in the den." Ronan was seated in his favorite armchair, a book unopened in his lap. A glass of wine, always wine, on the side table. He looked up, barely surprised to see me. "You came," he said. "I did." I sat across from him, pulled the report from my coat, and placed it on the table between us. One word was bolded at the top, barbiturate. He didn't reach for it. He just stared at me. "You tried to kill me," I said. He blinked, mouth tight. Then he looked away. "I only meant to knock you out," he muttered. "Forge a few papers. Change your will. I didn't think you didn't think I'd live." He rubbed his face with both hands, then lowered them slowly. "You have no wife, no children. The money would have come to me. I was drowning Callum. You drugged your son. I was desperate." I watched him shrink under his own words. His pride had finally cracked. But all I felt was a cold kind of clarity. "You're not going to the police?" he asked. "No," I said. "But you stay away from me. And you never touch Mom again." He nodded, defeated. For the first time I saw real panic in his eyes, not because of what he'd done, but because I had survived it. I turned and walked out without another word, but I could feel his confession trailing behind me like a shadow that no longer belonged to me. It was my mother who unlocked the study. I hadn't stepped foot in that room since I was a child, since before the walls started closing in around her. She paused at the door keys, trembling in her hand, then pushed it open like she was expecting the room to fight back. "It's in the safe," she said quietly. I followed her to the far corner where a small steel door sat behind a shelf of old business manuals. The keypad blinked faintly. She entered a 6-digit code. I recognized it, their wedding date. Inside were contracts, real estate deeds, some loose checks, and a small leather notebook, edges frayed with age. She pulled it out like it might disintegrate. "My father's," she whispered. He used to journal every morning. We sat on the carpet. She opened the notebook carefully, flipping past pages of names, numbers, and grocery lists until one caught her breath. The handwriting was jagged, slanted, harder than the rest. "Ronan brought over wine tonight. kept refilling my glass before I could say no, said something odd, to the end of old deals and the beginning of loyalty. I felt dizzy not long after. Something doesn't feel right. If anything happens— The entry stopped mid-sentence. She closed the book slowly, her hand pressed against the page as if trying to warm it back to life. Her face crumpled. I married the man who killed my father, she said, her voice small like a child's. I didn't know how to respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't reopen everything she had spent decades trying to keep buried. I reached for her hand and held it gently, letting the silence say what words couldn't. She leaned into me, breathing shallow, as if something inside her had just broken open. All the years she had spent trying to believe in him to keep the house from cracking, none of it mattered now. I should have seen it, she whispered. No, I said. He made sure you didn't. She closed her eyes. Then we see him now. We see him clearly. We sat there, the past laid out in ink and silence, with no more lies left to hold the room together. Declan Hale didn't ask why. He was the kind of man who'd seen enough to know when silence meant danger. I handed him my grandfather's journal entry and the lab report from Thanksgiving. He studied both without interruption, then nodded once. We'll start with the autopsy. It took weeks. My mother signed the paperwork with shaking hands. The court order moved slower than we hoped, but Declan kept pressure in the right places. When the medical examiner finally opened the casket and ran the toxicology analysis, the call came just after noon. Barbiturate, the same compound found in my wine glass, the same one that nearly stopped my father's heart, the same one that had ended my grandfather's decades ago. I told Mom first. She sat at the edge of her bed, hands gripping the frame, nodding slowly, like each word landed on her like a stone. I knew it, she said, but her voice wasn't broken anymore. It was steel. We met Jules Maury 2 days later, sharp eyes calm, voice a file folder thicker than most of my old contracts. She had already begun building the case, forged power of attorney forms, altered will documents, transfer agreements with my grandfather's signature traced not written. He rewrote your father's entire estate, Jules said, and everything pointed back to Ronan. I watched my mother take that in, not as the wife who had loved him, but as a daughter who had been robbed of closure. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Then I'll press charges, she said. Jules didn't blink. Are you ready for what that means? My mother looked up at her, then at me. It means I stop pretending I didn't know. It was the first time I saw her as someone other than my mother. She looked like someone reclaiming something stolen. Her voice steady her back, straight her grief, no longer. Something hidden behind lavender perfume and kind smiles. Declan and Jules worked quickly. The case built itself with every document, every detail my father had overlooked. Together, we sifted through the wreckage he'd buried in our lives. Each paper we unearthed made the weight of silence a little lighter. When we finally signed the court filing, my mother held the pen steady. Her name went on the line, and with it the past she was no longer willing to carry alone. She passed me the copy without a word, and for the first time in my life I saw her not as someone surviving, but as someone fighting back. The courtroom was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My mother sat on the witness stand, her shoulders square, her voice clear. No perfume, no jewelry, just truth. I lived with him for over 30 years, she began. I thought I understood what love required. I thought silence was survival. Her eyes flicked to Ronan, who sat at the defense table in a navy suit that hung loose on his frame. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. I stayed because I wanted to believe the violence was behind us. That what he did to our son, what he did to my father, that it was in the past. She took a breath, steadying. But the past doesn't stay buried when you drink it in a glass of wine. I watched the jury lean forward, He isolated us, she continued, controlled every bank account, every decision. He kept me quiet with guilt and charm, and I let him. I let him for too long. Her voice cracked only once, and it wasn't when she mentioned my name. It was when she said, "He took my father from me, and I never even asked how." Jules Maury stood beside her, hands folded, letting the silence do its work. The evidence spoke for itself. The forged documents, the autopsy report, the journal entry, the lab analysis, the identical sedative that nearly killed me and had succeeded with my grandfather. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours. Guilty. Attempted murder of a direct descendant. First-degree murder by poisoning. My father didn't look at me when the verdict was read. He didn't look at anyone. They led him out in cuffs. The door closed behind him with a sound more final than anything I'd ever heard. After the trial, my mother sold the house. She found a small cottage outside the city with a modest kitchen and a patch of earth in the back. She planted lavender there, rows of it. She said it helped her breathe again. I moved in with her that spring. We didn't talk much about Ronan after that. There was nothing left to say. We planted vegetables, drank tea in the afternoon, let the silence feel like rest instead of fear. One evening I sat on the porch as the sun sank low behind the hills. She was in the garden, knees in the dirt, coaxing new growth from the soil. Her hair had gone silver, and her hands bore lines I hadn't noticed before. But her smile was real. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything to go wrong.